You are unfit, Miss Brooks, unfit, unhinged, and unworthy of these children. The gavel slammed down, echoing like a gunshot in the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom of Fulton County. Nia Brooks, clutching a frayed manila folder to her chest, felt the air leave her lungs. But, Your Honor, I have the papers, the steady job, the new apartment. It's all here. Judge Harrison Vance didn't even look at the documents. With a flick of his wrist, he tore the custody petition in two, the sound sharp and final. Bailiff, remove her. He thought he'd silenced a nuisance. He didn't know he'd just ignited a fire that would burn for 20 years, a fire that one of the boys he took away would eventually use to burn his empire to the ground. The summer of 2006 hung heavy and humid over Atlanta, Georgia, the heat radiating off the asphalt like a physical weight. For Nia Brooks, a 24-year-old mother of two, the oppressive heat matched the suffocating dread in her chest. She stood outside the imposing facade of the Fulton County Courthouse, a grand structure of white columns that promised justice, but often delivered despair to those without means. She wore her best dress, a navy blue shift she'd ironed until the fabric shone, and clutched a thick manila folder as if it were a life preserver. Inside were pay stubs from her double shifts at the Grady Memorial Hospital cafeteria, a signed lease for a 2-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, and glowing character references from her pastor and her boys' teachers. Her sons, 5-year-old Malik and 3-year-old Tariq, were currently in the temporary care of her sister, Shanice Wright. Shanice, older and hardened by her own struggles, had taken the boys in when Nia's world had briefly, violently fallen apart. A string of bad luck, an abusive ex-partner who drained her savings, a subsequent eviction, and a brief, dark period of depression had led Child Services to intervene. It was meant to be temporary. 6 months, they said. 6 months to get back on her feet. Nia had done it in 4. She had clawed her way back from the abyss, fueled by the desperate, clawing need to have her boys back in her arms. She had jumped through every hoop, attended every mandated counseling session, and worked until her bones ached. Today was the day she would prove it. Today was the day she got her family back. Judge Harrison Vance presided over Family Courtroom 3B with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his word was literal law. He was a scion of a prominent Georgia family, a man whose career had been greased by generational wealth and country club handshakes. To him, the people who stood before him were rarely human beings. They were case files, statistics, and annoyances keeping him from his tea time at the Piedmont Driving Club. When Nia's case was called, she stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her court-appointed attorney, a frantic woman named Sarah, who was juggling 20 other cases, quickly laid out the facts. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice strained. Ms. Brooks has exceeded all requirements set forth by the court. She has secured stable housing, maintained steady employment at Grady Memorial, and completed all necessary counseling. We petition for the immediate reinstatement of full custody. Judge Vance barely looked up from the paperwork on his desk. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and peered down his nose at Nia. He didn't see a mother who had fought a war for her children. He saw a young black woman from a zip code he associated only with crime and blight. He saw a stereotype. Ms. Brooks. His voice was smooth, patronizing, and utterly cold. The record shows a history of instability, eviction, domestic disturbances. That was the past, Your Honor, Nia interjected, unable to contain herself. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. I have the proof right here. I've changed everything. She lifted the manila folder, the physical manifestation of her blood, sweat, and tears. I will not have outbursts in my courtroom, Vance snapped, slamming his gavel. This court's primary concern is the welfare of the minors, Malik and Tariq. Given the severity of the initial intervention, I am not convinced that a return to your care is in their best interest. But the papers? Nia cried out, stepping closer to the bench, the desperation clawing at her throat. Look at the papers, please, Vance's face tightened into a mask of contempt. He snatched the folder from the bailiff who had intercepted it. He didn't open it. He didn't look at the glowing letters from the teachers who said Malik was thriving when his mother visited, or the pay stubs proving she could afford the new apartment. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, Judge Harrison Vance took the thick stack of papers in both hands and tore them down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was loud in the suddenly silent courtroom. It sounded like the ripping of Nayar's heart. "Petition denied," Vance said flatly, tossing the torn halves into the wastebasket beside his chair. "Custody remains with the state, pending permanent placement. The mother is deemed unfit. Bailiff, clear the court." Nayar collapsed. Her knees buckled, and she hit the polished wood floor with a heavy thud. The world tilted and spun. The screams tore from her throat, raw, guttural sounds of absolute agony. "My babies! You can't take my babies!" Shanice, who had been sitting in the gallery, rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her sister as the bailiffs moved in to physically drag them out. As Naya was pulled through the heavy oak doors, her last sight of the courtroom was Judge Vance, already looking down at the next case file, entirely unmoved by the life he had just destroyed. He hadn't just denied a petition. He had shredded a promise, a family, and a mother's soul. The aftermath of Judge Vance's ruling was a slow, agonizing fracture of the Brooks family. The temporary foster care arrangement the state had placed the boys in was meant to be a stopgap, but with Naya declared unfit and her petition violently dismissed, the machinery of the child welfare system ground into permanent motion. Shanice fought desperately to keep the boys. She hired a lawyer, draining her own modest savings, to petition for kinship care. But Vance, wielding his power with malicious intent, denied her petition as well. He cited a minor 10-year-old misdemeanor on Shanice's record, a bounce check she had resolved years ago, as evidence of poor moral character. It was a flimsy excuse, a blatant abuse of discretion. But in his courtroom, his word was the final decree. "He's punishing us," Shanice whispered to Nia late one night, the two women sitting in the dark of Nia's pristine, empty two-bedroom apartment. The silence in the rooms, meant to be filled with the laughter of children, was deafening. He looked at us, saw who we were, where we came from, and decided we didn't deserve them. Nayar was a ghost of the woman who had marched into the courthouse. The spark had been extinguished, replaced by a hollow, consuming grief. She spent her days working double shifts at the hospital, the repetitive, numbing labor the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Her nights were spent staring at the walls, haunted by the memory of the tearing paper and the judge's cold eyes. The separation was hardest on the boys. Malik, at 5, understood enough to know he had been taken away. He remembered his mother's face, her smell, the way she sang him to sleep. He remembered the promise she had made. "Mummy's coming back, baby. I promise." When the state decided to place the boys in permanent foster care, a final devastating blow fell. Because of the shortage of homes willing to take siblings, and because of a system more focused on efficiency than emotional well-being, the unthinkable happened. Malik and Tariq were separated. Tariq, young and adaptable, was placed with an older couple in the suburbs. Malik, however, was older, more aware, and profoundly traumatized by the sudden loss of his mother, his aunt, and now his brother. He was labeled difficult. He bounced from home to home, carrying the jagged edges of his broken family within him. In one of his early placements, a sterile, crowded group home in Decatur, Malik found himself sitting on a lumpy mattress, staring at a small, crumpled photograph of his mother he had managed to hide in his sock. He was 7 years old now. The memory of the courthouse was vague, a terrifying blur of shouting and crying, but the feeling of abandonment was sharp and constant. He remembered the man in the black robe, the man high up behind the big desk, the man who had made his mother scream. One evening, a social worker named Mrs. Higgins, a kind but overworked woman, sat beside him. She was trying to explain for the 1000th time why he couldn't go home. "Your mother loves you, Malik. Mrs. Higgins said softly. But sometimes grown-ups can't provide the safe home a child needs. A judge has to make a hard decision. What judge? Malik asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. The judge who handled your case, she replied, not realizing the weight of the information she was about to impart. Judge Vance. He decided it was best for you to be here. The name landed in Malik's mind like a seed dropping into fertile soil. Judge Vance. He didn't fully understand the legalities, the bureaucracy, or the systemic prejudices that had torn his life apart. He only understood that a man named Judge Vance had taken his mother, his brother, and his home. As the years passed, Malik grew. He grew tall, he grew quiet, and he grew incredibly focused. The anger that had initially manifested as tantrums and defiance crystallized into something cold and sharp. He excelled in school, driven by a singular burning need to understand the system that had crushed his family. He spent hours in the local library, reading about the law, about courts, about judges. He tracked down the few records he could access. He found the date of the hearing. He found the name, the Honorable Harrison Vance, Superior Court of Fulton County. While Tariq grew up in a comfortable, loving but distant suburban home, eventually losing the memory of his early years, Malik held onto the past with a white-knuckled grip. He sought out his Aunt Shanice when he was 16. Shanice, older and deeply scarred by the years of fighting a losing battle, wept when she saw him. It was Shanice who filled in the gaps. She told him about the petition, the apartment, the steady job, and she told him about the torn papers. He didn't even look at them, Malik, Shanice said, her voice shaking with 20 years of suppressed rage. He just tore them up. He tore your mother's life up right in front of her. Malik sat at Shanice's kitchen table, a young man with a brilliant mind and a soul forged in the fires of injustice. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply nodded. I know, Malik said quietly, and I'm going to make sure he pays for every single piece of paper. Revenge, Malik quickly learned, was not a wild, untamed beast. It was a glacier. It moved slowly, silently, crushing everything in its path with immense invisible pressure. By the time he enrolled at the Georgia State University College of Law, right in the beating heart of downtown Atlanta, he had weaponized his trauma. He wasn't there to join a white shoe firm. He wasn't there to network at cocktail mixers or buy a McMansion in Buckhead. He was there to learn how to dismantle a god, brick by legal brick. Malik was a phantom in the lecture halls. He didn't attend frat parties, he rarely spoke unless called upon, but his exam scores were legendary, bordering on intimidating. He didn't just read the law, he dissected it like a coroner looking for a cause of death. He devoured case law, procedural loopholes, and the intricate, often corrupt dancing of political maneuvering within the Fulton County judicial system. He studied Judge Harrison Vance's career, like a religious scholar studies a sacred text, memorizing his rulings, cross-referencing his campaign donors with corporate registries, and tracking his weekend golf partners. Vance had recently been elevated to Chief Judge of the Superior Court. He was older now, his hair completely silver, his public image carefully polished by expensive PR firms. His power was absolute. He was a king in a black robe, untouchable and serene in his corruption. During his second year of law school, Malik took a rainy Tuesday evening to visit his mother. Naya lived in a small, federally subsidized apartment in West End, a far cry from the hopeful two-bedroom she had leased 20 years prior. The vibrant, determined woman who had marched into the courthouse clutching her proof of worth was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. The years of double shifts pushing heavy carts at Grady Hospital, crippling clinical depression, and the agonizing, unending ache of losing her children had broken her body and her spirit. She suffered from severe diabetic neuropathy and spent her days in a worn recliner, watching daytime television with the volume too low, the blinds drawn tight against the harsh Atlanta sun. The apartment smelled faintly of medicinal creams and stale air. When Malik walked in, bringing the sharp smell of rain and expensive coffee, Nia smiled, a frail, trembling thing that barely reached her clouded eyes. "Look at my handsome lawyer," she rasped, reaching out with shaking fingers to touch the lapel of his tailored suit jacket. Malik had maxed out his student loans and worked graveyard shifts as a paralegal just to look the part. Armor was expensive, and he needed to look like he belonged in their world to destroy it. "Not a lawyer yet, Mama. Soon," Malik said, sitting on the edge of her worn sofa, careful not to disturb the piles of unpaid medical bills. He held her hands. They were impossibly thin, the skin like translucent parchment over brittle bones. A fierce, protective rage spiked in his chest, burning so hot it threatened to choke him. This was Vance's handiwork. Vance had done this just as surely as if he had taken a bat to her knees. He had sentenced her to a slow, agonizing decay. "You work too hard, baby," Nia whispered, her eyes drifting back to the flickering light of the television screen. "You need to rest. You need to find a nice girl. Give me some grandbabies to hold." "I have work to do, Mama," Malik replied, his voice a low rumble. He never told her about his true target. If she knew he was hunting the most powerful judge in the county, the sheer terror of retaliation would kill her. "I'm going to make sure nobody ever gets hurt the way we did. I promise." It was an echo of the promise she had made to him 2 decades ago. As Malik walked back to his car, the neon lights of the city reflecting in the oily puddles on the asphalt, he pulled up a contact on his phone. It was an acceptance email for a highly coveted internship at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. He was in. The wolf had entered the pasture, wearing sheep's clothing tailored to perfection. 2 years after passing the bar with the highest score in his cohort, Malik was a rising star in the DA's office. He was an assistant district attorney known for his icy demeanor, his photographic memory, and his ruthless efficiency in the courtroom. Defense attorneys loathed facing him. He never raised his voice, but he dismantled their arguments with clinical, devastating precision. His colleagues whispered about him around the water cooler. He was a machine, a man without a personal life, entirely consumed by the law. What they didn't know was that every late night, every weekend spent in the dusty, fluorescent-lit basement archives of the courthouse was dedicated to Operation Vance. Malik had carefully curated his caseload to serve his true purpose. He volunteered for the drudgery that ambitious ADAs avoided like the plague: appellate reviews, post-conviction relief petitions, and agonizingly dull audits of juvenile court placements. It was tedious, unglamorous work, but it gave Malik the ultimate skeleton key: unrestricted, unquestioned access to the historical records of Family Courtroom 3B. Breathing in the smell of decaying paper and mildew, he began running complex data models on Vance's rulings over the past 15 years. At first, the pattern just looked like severe systemic bias. Vance consistently handed down maximum sentences to minority youths, frequently bypassing diversion programs, and overwhelmingly denied custody restorations to low-income parents, often citing vague instability. It was disgusting. But sadly, in the eyes of the Judicial Oversight Commission, it wasn't strictly illegal. It was just branded as tough-on-crime conservatism, applauded by his wealthy constituents. But Malik knew men like Vance. Arrogance always bred greed. Power wasn't enough. It had to be profitable. He dug deeper, looking past the gavels, the transcripts, and the tears, and started looking into the ledgers. The breakthrough happened at 2 a.m. on a quiet Thursday. The city was asleep, and the only light in the archives was the harsh glare of Malik's laptop. He was cross-referencing juvenile placement records with state funding allocations. A glaring anomaly leaped off the spreadsheet, a statistical impossibility. Over a 10-year period, whenever Judge Vance removed a child from a troubled home or sentenced a juvenile offender, an astonishing 78% of them were remanded to a specific private behavioral modification facility in rural Georgia, the Pine Ridge Youth Academy. Pine Ridge was a notoriously strict privately owned detention center surrounded by high wire. It billed the state of Georgia an exorbitant premium, thousands of dollars per month, per child, classifying them as requiring maximum intervention. Malik's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled up the corporate filings for Pine Ridge. It was owned by a holding company out of Delaware, Apex Corrections LLC. He spent the next 3 days running on black coffee and adrenaline, tracking the shell companies, peeling back the layers of LLCs, offshore accounts, and blind trusts designed to obscure the true beneficiaries. Finally, he found the rotting core. A consulting firm named Blue Ridge Advisory was retained by Pine Ridge to the tune of $25,000 a month for administrative guidance. The firm's registered agent was a man named Arthur Vance, Harrison Vance's brother. It wasn't just racism. It wasn't just classism. It was a calculated industrial-scale monetization of human misery. Judge Vance was tearing vulnerable families apart, fabricating the severity of the children's needs, and feeding them into a private prison pipeline. In return, he was getting a massive laundered cut of the profits through his brother's phantom firm. He was selling children. He had sold Malik. The revelation hit Malik with the physical force of a freight train. He pushed back from the desk, gasping for air in the dusty room. He had his motive. He had the paper trail. But paper trails could be buried by expensive defense attorneys and compliant judges. To bring down a chief judge, to bypass the political immunity Vance enjoyed, he needed a witness. He needed someone who could testify to the horrors inside Pine Ridge, someone who could link the abuse directly to the psychological evaluations mandated in Vance's courtroom. Finding a willing witness against Chief Judge Vance was like trying to find a man willing to step voluntarily in front of a firing squad. The legal community of Atlanta was a tight-knit ecosystem, and Vance was its apex predator. Speak out against him, and your career was over. Motions would be inexplicably denied, lucrative clients would dry up overnight, and vicious rumors would destroy your reputation before you could even mount a defense. Malik needed an outcast, someone who had already been chewed up and spat out by the machine. He found one in Elias Thorne. Elias was a former public defender who had been disbarred 5 years prior under highly suspicious circumstances involving misplaced exculpatory evidence in one of Vance's high-profile trials. Malik tracked the disgraced lawyer to a dingy, grease-stained diner in Smyrna, where Elias was nursing a black coffee and a profound sense of defeat. He looked 10 years older than his 50s. His cheap suit was wrinkled, his tie bore a faded coffee stain, and his eyes were bloodshot and deeply paranoid. Malik slid into the vinyl booth across from him, placing a thick manila folder on the Formica table. The irony of the folder, so similar to the one his mother had clutched, was not lost on him. "I'm not talking to the DA's office," Elias grunted, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his mug. He didn't even look up. "I'm done with the circus. Go find another scapegoat." "I'm not here on official business, Mr. Thorne," Malik said, his voice smooth and deadly quiet, cutting through the hum of the diner's neon sign. "I'm here about Harrison Vance." At the name, Elias flinched as if he'd been struck. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing at Malik's immaculate appearance. "You're a fool, kid. Whatever crusade you're on, drop it right now. Vance owns the board. He owns the pieces. You're just a pawn who doesn't know he's already been sacrificed." "I know about Pine Ridge," Malik said, entirely ignoring the warning. He tapped the thick folder. "I have the financial links between Vance's brother and the facility. I have the wire transfers to Blue Ridge Advisory. I know he was getting kickbacks for every kid he sent up there to be broken." Elias stared at the folder, a complex mixture of abject fear and vindictive hunger crossing his weathered face. "You have the money trail? It doesn't matter," he scoffed bitterly. "Vance will say his brother is an independent contractor. Plausible deniability. The ethics board will slap his wrist behind closed doors, and he'll have you fired, blacklisted, and facing fabricated felony charges before the ink dries on the censure. Which is why I need you." Malik leaned in, closing the distance between them. "I need to know how the pipeline actually worked, How did Vance guarantee the kids ended up specifically at Pine Ridge and not state facilities? What was the legal mechanism? Elias laughed, a dry hacking sound that dissolved into a cough. It was a well-oiled machine, kid. Vance had a psychiatric evaluator in his pocket. Dr. Aris Thorne. Yeah, my cousin. Vance would mandate psychological evaluations for the kids he targeted. Aris would give them cookie-cutter diagnoses of severe, violent behavioral disorders, regardless of the truth, recommending specialized, high-security residential treatment. Pine Ridge was conveniently the only facility in the state equipped to handle those specific fake diagnoses. The state footed the exorbitant bill. Pine Ridge got rich, and Vance got his cut. Will your cousin testify? Malik asked, his pulse quickening. Aris is dead, Elias said flatly, the life draining from his voice. Prescription overdose 2 years ago. The guilt ate him alive. He couldn't sleep knowing what was happening to those kids. I tried to blow the whistle for him. I took his encrypted files to the Judicial Commission. 3 weeks later, a bag of heroin miraculously appeared in my desk drawer. I was framed for tampering with evidence, and I was disbarred. Vance destroyed my life without even blinking. Malik felt a cold, calculating satisfaction settle over him. Vance's hubris was his ultimate weakness. He left a trail of bodies, ruined careers, and broken lives in his wake, assuming none of them would ever have the strength to rise up. I don't need your cousin, Malik said, standing up and sliding a card across the table. I just needed to know the mechanism. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. When this is over, you'll get your license back. I guarantee it. As Malik walked to his car, he realized his next terrifying step. He needed a victim of Pine Ridge. Someone who had been fraudulently diagnosed by Dr. Thorne and sent to hell by Judge Vance. He opened his laptop in the driver's seat and logged into the sealed juvenile databases. He began filtering the thousands of names sent to the facility by Vance's court, searching for a ghost. The harsh blue glow of the laptop screen cast deep shadows across Malik's face in the dark, suffocating cab of his car. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof as he scrolled through the list of ruined childhoods. Name after name, a litany of broken potential and stolen innocence. He was looking for someone with a clean enough current record to be a credible witness on the stand. Someone who hadn't been completely consumed by the criminal justice system that Vance had pushed them into. Then his finger froze on the trackpad. The breath completely stopped in his throat. The drumming of the rain and the ambient noise of the city seemed to fall away into a void of static. There, on page 42 of the database, was a name he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. A name that tasted like ash on his tongue. Tariq Miller. Malik clicked the file, his hands suddenly trembling so violently he could barely operate the mouse. Former name, Tariq Brooks. The file read like a bureaucratic horror story. Tariq hadn't lived the idyllic, privileged suburban life Malik had spent years trying to imagine to comfort himself. The older couple who had adopted him were utterly unprepared for the deep-seated trauma of a toddler violently separated from his mother and only brother. When Tariq hit puberty, the unaddressed trauma manifested not as compliance, but as explosive anger, truancy, and petty theft. At 14, unable and unwilling to cope, his adoptive parents legally surrendered him back to the state. He ended up right back where he started, in juvenile court. The presiding judge, Harrison Vance, the psychological evaluator, Dr. Aris Thorne, the placement, Pine Ridge Youth Academy, duration, 4 grueling years. Vance hadn't just destroyed Malik's childhood. He hadn't just taken their mother. He had consumed Tariq entirely, using him twice over to line his pockets. Malik gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles popped, hot tears of absolute unfiltered rage streaming down his face, blurring the screen. The judge had thrown both brothers into the meat grinder. It took Malik 2 agonizing days using restricted DA resources to track his brother down. Tariq was 23 now. He was working as a mechanic at a sprawling, greasy auto shop in an industrial park in Marietta, a concrete wasteland on the outskirts of the city. When Malik pulled his pristine BMW into the rutted gravel lot, he felt a sickening knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. He walked into the cavernous, loud garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust, burning oil, and stale sweat. A young man was working under the hood of a rusted Ford truck, his hands black with grease, a faded, jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. Malik recognized the sharp shape of his jaw, the defiant set of his shoulders. It was the ghost of their absent father, the ghost of Naya before the light went out of her eyes. "Tariq!" Malik called out over the deafening roar of an air compressor. The young man wiped his hands on a filthy rag and turned around. His eyes, wary, deeply shadowed, and hardened by years of brutal survival, locked onto Malik's expensive suit. He didn't recognize the man in front of him. "Who's asking? I paid my probation fees. I don't want any trouble." "It's Malik," he said, his voice cracking, the polished ADA persona shattering instantly. "I'm your brother." Tariq froze. The rag dropped from his hands into the dirt, pooling in the oil. For a long, agonizing moment, neither moved. The 20-year chasm between them seemed impossible to cross. Then Tariq scoffed, a harsh sound, shaking his head and taking a step back. "My brother is a memory, a kid from another life. You look like a cop. Get out of my bay." "I'm an ADA," Malik said, stepping closer, desperate to bridge the gap. "Tariq, please. I know what happened to you. I read the file. I know about the adoption falling through. I know about Pine Ridge." At the mere mention of the facility, Tariq's demeanor instantly violently shifted. The tough, defensive exterior vanished, replaced by a flash of raw, visceral terror that made him stumble back a step, quickly masked by intense, cornered aggression. "Don't you ever say that name to me," he snarled, grabbing a heavy wrench from a nearby cart. "You don't know anything about that place. You don't know what they did." "I know Judge Vance sent you there," Malik pushed forward, lowering his voice, ignoring the weapon. "I know he was making money off every beating you took in that hellhole. He got paid for every day you spent locked in the dark. I'm going to put him in prison, Tariq. I'm going to destroy him. But I can't do it without you. I need you to testify about what happened inside." Tariq laughed, a bitter, broken sound that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. "Testify? Against Vance? You are out of your damn mind, Suit. They beat kids to death in that place, Malik. They called them accidents. They locked us in solitary closets for weeks, until we forgot our own names." The warden, a psycho named Garris, he used to brag that the judges were his business partners. "You think you can touch a guy like Vance with a testimony? He's a ghost. He owns the DA, he owns the cops, he owns the whole city. He doesn't own me," Malik said, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity, locking onto his brother's. "He tore up Mum's papers. He took you away from me, and then he sold you for scrap. Tariq, Mum is sick. She's dying slowly in a tiny apartment, and she survives because she thinks you had a good, safe life. Help me burn his empire to the ground." Tariq looked at Malik. Really looked at him for the first time, seeing past the expensive suit and the polished shoes to the terrifying, cold determination in his older brother's eyes. He saw the same anger that burned in his own chest. Slowly, the fight drained out of him. He lowered the wrench. Tariq reached deep into his greasy overalls and pulled out a battered, oil-stained, leather-bound notebook. "Warden Garris," Tariq said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, looking around the garage as if expecting Vance's men to appear from the shadows. He was arrogant. He didn't trust computers. He kept a ledger. The real books. The kickbacks, the fake diagnoses, the payments to Blue Ridge. Everything. He used to make me clean his office on my hands and knees. I know where he hides it in his floorboards. You get that ledger, you get Vance." The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. The map was drawn. The trap was set. Malik was a lawyer, not a burglar. He knew that if he or Tariq broke into Pine Ridge to steal the ledger, the evidence would be inadmissible as fruit of the poisonous tree, and Vance would slip through the cracks once again. Instead, Malik took Tariq's sworn, agonizingly detailed deposition, combined it with the financial breadcrumbs he'd unearthed, and walked straight past the local DA's office. He went directly to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit at the Atlanta field office. Federal agents are not easily swayed, but Malik's presentation was a masterpiece of forensic accounting and horrifying witness testimony. When Special Agent in Charge Reynolds saw the estimated millions laundered through the Kids for Cash pipeline, his jaw tightened. Within 48 hours, a federal magistrate judge signed a sealed, no-knock search warrant for the Pine Ridge Youth Academy. The raid took place under the cover of a moonless Tuesday night. Malik, wearing a Kevlar vest over his dress shirt, rode in the command vehicle. Tariq sat beside him, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on the imposing barbed wire fences that had once been his entire world. He had insisted on coming, acting as the confidential informant to guide them directly to the hidden cache. At exactly 3 a.m., the gates of Pine Ridge were breached. Dozens of heavily armed FBI tactical agents swarmed the compound, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Sirens wailed, shattering the rural silence. "Main building secure. Target is in the administrative wing," crackled the radio. Malik and Tariq followed Agent Reynolds into the suffocating institutional halls of the facility. The smell of floor wax and stale cabbage hit Tariq like a physical blow, threatening to drag him back into the abyss of his childhood trauma. But Malik placed a firm, grounding hand on his brother's shoulder. They moved toward the warden's office. Inside, Warden Garris, a thick-necked, balding man in an undershirt, was frantically shoving documents into a heavy-duty paper shredder. When the door was kicked off its hinges by the FBI, Garris froze, his eyes darting like a cornered rat. "Away from the desk, hands where I can see them," Reynolds barked. Garris was slammed against the wall and handcuffed. Tariq stepped into the room, his eyes dark and hard. He didn't look at the trembling warden. He walked straight to a heavy oak bookshelf on the far wall. He pushed it aside with a grunt of effort, revealing a scuffed section of hardwood floor. Kneeling, Tariq jammed a tactical pry bar he'd borrowed from an agent into a nearly invisible seam. With a loud crack, the floorboard popped up. Inside the hollow cavity rested a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age and heavy with the sins of a decade. Agent Reynolds pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and lifted the book. He flipped through the handwritten entries, columns of names, dates of fraudulent psychological evaluations signed by Dr. Aris Thorne, and next to every single name, a dollar amount routed to Blue Ridge Advisory, Judge Vance's brother. "We got him," Reynolds muttered, looking at Malik. Malik looked at the ledger, then at Tariq, who was breathing heavily, a profound, visible weight finally lifting from his shoulders. "No," Malik corrected softly, his voice colder than the night air outside. "Now, we trap him." The walls were closing in on Chief Judge Harrison Vance, but insulated by his own supreme arrogance, he couldn't feel the squeeze. The FBI had executed the Pine Ridge raid with surgical precision, placing Warden Garris in federal holding before he could make a single phone call. Faced with 30 years for racketeering, child endangerment, and wire fraud, Garris flipped on Vance in less than 2 hours. He sang like a choir boy, verifying every single entry in the ledger. Meanwhile, Malik was meticulously building the gallows. Working in secret with the feds, he drafted a 400-page RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, indictment against the chief judge. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction, leaving no loophole, no plausible deniability, and no chance for bail. It was a brisk Thursday morning when the trap finally snapped shut. Judge Vance sat high on his bench in Fulton County Superior Court, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his black robe draped in a way that screamed absolute authority. The courtroom was packed. He was about to sentence a young man for a minor drug offense, leaning into the microphone to deliver one of his trademark, hypocritical lectures on personal responsibility and moral failings. "In my courtroom, we do not reward instability," Vance droned, looking down his nose at the terrified defendant. It was the exact same tone he had used 20 years ago. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding bang. The murmurs in the gallery died instantly as 6 FBI agents, wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters across their backs, marched down the center aisle. Flanking them was the special agent in charge, and walking right at the front, carrying a thick sealed folder, was Assistant District Attorney Malik Brooks. Vance's gavel hung in the air, his face flushed with indignation. "What is the meaning of this disruption? Mr. Brooks, you are entirely out of line. I will have you held in contempt." "I don't think you will, Your Honor," Malik said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent, stunned courtroom. He stopped directly in front of the bench, looking up at the man who had played God with his life. He didn't feel like a frightened 5-year-old anymore. He felt like an executioner. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "Harrison Vance, you are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for violations of the RICO Act, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and human trafficking." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Reporters in the back rows scrambled for their phones. Vance's face drained of color, his aristocratic features collapsing into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "This is an outrage," Vance sputtered, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of his desk. "I am the chief judge of this county. You cannot march in here on baseless, fabricated accusations." "They aren't baseless, Harrison," Malik said smoothly. He stepped up to the evidence block and dropped a photocopy of Warden Garris's ledger onto the wood. The loud thwack echoed like a gunshot. "We have the Pine Ridge ledger. We have Warden Garris's confession. We have the offshore accounts traced to your brother." Vance stared at the pages, his eyes wide. The reality of his utter annihilation finally piercing his armor of hubris. He looked at Malik, really looking at the young ADA's face, searching for a reason behind the relentless, terrifying focus in his eyes. "Why?" Vance whispered, the microphone catching his trembling voice. "Who are you?" Malik stepped closer to the bench. The entire courtroom held its breath. This wasn't just an arrest, it was an execution of character. 20 years ago, Malik began, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that demanded absolute attention. "A young mother stood in a courtroom exactly like this one. She brought you proof of her employment. She brought you a lease for a safe home. She begged you to look at her papers so she could have her 2 little boys back." Vance's brow furrowed, sifting through thousands of ruined lives in his memory, trying to find the one standing before him. "You called her unfit," Malik continued, his voice rising, carrying the weight of 2 decades of grief. "You didn't even open the folder. You took her papers and you tore them in half. You tore my family in half." Recognition, followed immediately by sheer paralyzing terror, dawned in Vance's eyes. "You separated me from my brother Tariq. You threw him into Pine Ridge so you could collect a $25,000 kickback on his suffering." Malik's voice was a roar now, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "My name is Malik Brooks, and court is adjourned." Vance slumped back in his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of him as the FBI agents bypassed the bailiff, ascended the steps to the bench, and pulled the chief judge to his feet. The metallic click of the handcuffs securing around Vance's wrists was the sweetest sound Malik had ever heard. The king had been dragged from his throne. The trial was a national media sensation. The Kids for Cash scandal ripped through the Georgia judicial system like a hurricane. Disbarred attorney Elias Thorne testified. Warden Garris testified. And Tariq, standing tall and unbroken, took the stand to recount the horrors of Pine Ridge. Vance's expensive defense attorneys were utterly powerless against the mountain of evidence Malik had assembled. It took the federal jury less than 4 hours to return a guilty verdict on all 42 counts. The sentencing judge, a strict federal appointee with zero tolerance for public corruption, showed no mercy. Harrison Vance, stripped of his robes, his wealth, and his legacy, was sentenced to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. The evening after the sentencing, the brutal Atlanta heat broke into a cool, gentle breeze. Malik and Tariq walked shoulder to shoulder up the concrete stairs to Naya's apartment in the West End. When they opened the door, Naya was sitting in her worn recliner, watching the evening news. The headline flashing across the screen read, "Disgraced Chief Judge gets 30 years." Malik walked over and gently muted the television. Nia looked up, her clouded eyes widening as she saw not one, but two tall silhouettes in her living room. Tariq stepped forward, tears streaming down his scarred face, and fell to his knees beside her chair. "Hi, Mama," Tariq choked out, burying his face in her lap. Nia let out a breathless, trembling sob. Her shaking hands reached down, tangling in Tariq's hair, then reaching out to pull Malik down with them. The three of them held onto each other, a tangled knot of weeping, healing, and profound love. The system had tried to crush them into dust, but they had survived. Malik looked over his mother's frail shoulder, his eyes resting on the television screen, showing Vance being led away in chains. The ledger was closed. The debt was paid in full. Justice had finally been served. Karma has no deadline, and the truth will always find its way to the light. Judge Vance thought he could play God with the lives of the vulnerable, tearing a loving mother away from her children just to line his own pockets. But he forgot one crucial rule. You never know what the child you break today will grow up to become tomorrow. Malik Brooks weaponized his trauma, mastered the very system that destroyed his family, and used the law to drop the hammer on a corrupt empire. If this story of absolute justice, sibling loyalty, and a mother's unbroken love gave you chills, make sure you hit that like button. Share this video with someone who